Kia ora everyone. As Travis described, I'm the Environment Policy Manager at Horticulture New Zealand, and my background is in science, primarily in hydrology and water quality and catchment scale natural resource management, but now I work in policy and my areas cover climate change, air, land and water. I don't know much about bioprotection, and so what I'm going to speak to you guys about today is about the horticulture sector in New Zealand, but also about the vision of Horticulture New Zealand, which is healthy food for all, forever. And I'm going to speak about that from my perspective, which is around environment policy, but perhaps that will offer some thoughts for your own work. There are 6,000 growers in New Zealand, 60,000 people are employed in the horticulture industry. The industry value is 6.8 billion and 4.6 billion of that is related to export. And that means that about nearly a third of the value is related to the domestic market. We have 130 overseas markets, and growers produce more than 100 types of fruits and vegetables. And when we think about the very wide range of fruits and vegetables that are grown, some of them are grown predominantly for export markets. You know, our key export crops are kiwi fruit and apples. I think onions is next, but then there are very, very many crops, and some of those, a small proportion, is exported and the remaining part is for domestic, and there are many crops that are grown solely for New Zealand consumers. So horticulture is a sector worth protecting, and as I described earlier, I'm going to help explain why I think that is. So HortNZ's vision is healthy food for all, forever. Oranga kai, oranga tangata, haere ake nai. And because I work in policy, I thought that it would be useful to define the terms. So that is what I thought I would do. So first of all, when we think about what is healthy food, I thought, well, it's more perhaps than just the body. It's about our minds and our as well. And so, of course, people like the idea of eating healthy food. And so, as an industry, we tap into that and we promote the health benefits of eating food. And so, for example, here's a Zespri, marketing which talks about immunity. What's really important underpinning those claims is the research that supports, the science that supports those nutritional claims, so they are robust. The other aspect is around certification, so people want to have reassurance that the food they eat is safe. The GAP programs are really important, and all growers in New Zealand who sell to a supermarket or export have to have their food certified by independent assurance. And those assurance programs look at a range of elements, but including food safety. And so that, would look at key aspects such as, agrochemicals and, or water that might include E. coli or compost, and to ensure that the food that leaves those growers is safe to eat. What we have at the moment in terms of environmental management is a focus on a kind of integrated farm planning approach, which is looking at adding more elements to farm plans. And so I work in freshwater, where we're expecting, freshwater farm plans to become more common, in greenhouse gas management, but also into biodiversity and biosecurity. One of the things that we at HortNZ advocate for is that those sort of integrated farm plans should be managed within a common assurance framework, and that assurance framework must be robust, because the claims that we make about the health of the food that we eat, or the safety of that, or the degree of sustainability, it must be trustworthy. The other aspect, of course, about healthy food is actually its health for our bodies. And so, I think the Ministry of Health recommends that people eat 5+ a day. In New Zealand, low fruit and vegetable consumption and high sodium intake was the second leading cause of health loss in New Zealand. So it's not just about the idea of healthy food. People actually need to eat healthy food too. And at this level, it's not just about the value of selling products to people and the benefit to the economy from that. It's also about the health cost of people not having the nutrition that their bodies need. Of course, the other part of healthy food as well is perhaps about our soul, the way that food makes us feel. And I think in all cultures, the eating food with your friends and family, the ability to share food generously and receive it with grace is very important for people's well-being. It's also about the role that food plays in meeting people's cultural needs. And, in New Zealand, we have a wonderful climate and the ability to grow a great many crops. And we have a history of growers from different parts of the world who have brought different growing traditions to New Zealand. For example, the Chinese growers who have been so important in providing green vegetables for New Zealanders over a long period of time, and a great range of vegetables. Those growing systems are at risk now because they tend to be of a small scale in the peri-urban areas where the land value is very high and where there's increasing pressure for urban development. The other part, of course, about food is about the food that we don't eat, or the food that is impacted. And I have a picture up here of inanga. So, in New Zealand, many of our lowland streams have been drained. The habitats that would support mahinga kai have been compromised by the choices that we have made about the food that we are producing, the food that we produce for export and the food that we grow here. And so that has an impact on the choices that people can make. And then also the ability to grow your own food. There is a real connection, and particularly I think for urban people, a kind of a loss of sense of place. And so the role that growing your own food in a kind of a community scale can have in terms of people's well-being is important. Of course, for HortNZ, our vision is about healthy food for all, forever. And so the scale is larger than just that sort of community scale. When I thought about what the term for all could mean, I looked to the Fit for the Better World vision, which is a sort of a strategy developed by the Primary Sector Council, and it has this statement, and it says, "We are the farmers, growers, fishers, makers and crafters of Aotearoa, New Zealand. We aspire to an enriched future by providing the world's most discerning consumers with outstanding, ethically produced food, natural fibres, drinks, and bioproducts, all sourced from our land and oceans." And it also has this kind of principle of taio ora, tangata ora. If the natural world is healthy, so too are the people. And I think that the taio ora, tangata ora principle resonates with me because my way of thinking is that, people are part of the natural world, and so what is good for our bodies is likely to be good for the world and vice versa. And what this vision kind of, I think, looks towards is a place where our food system in New Zealand is in more balance with our natural world, and we're able to gain higher value from our products and sell those to the most discerning consumers. And in horticulture we do sell high-value products. Kiwi fruit and apples are premium products that are exported throughout the world, and the interesting thing about those products is that they're not premium because they are value-added, really, or processed. They're premium because you can eat them raw. You can eat them without anything. It's something about the simpleness of them that creates their premium value. But there perhaps are other opportunities for new crops or nutraceuticals that we could sell, throughout the world that we could produce sustainably in New Zealand. However, for all isn't just about selling, those premium products across the world, because as I described earlier, in the horticulture sector, we have a strong part of our industry is focused domestically. And because of New Zealand's geographic isolation, we can't look to import fresh, all of the fresh food that we need to eat here. We are reliant on growing it. And so, if growers were to produce that 5 plus a day that we need, that would be 15 million servings of vegetables every day, 10 million servings of fruit. It's a lot of food that needs to be produced for New Zealand here. Unfortunately, New Zealanders are not eating 5 plus a day, and only about half of us are eating 3 plus vegetables a day, and it is declining year on year. And interestingly, it's declining at about the same rate as our vegetable growing areas are also declining. There's been a recent study looking at food hardship and early childhood nutrition, and 1 in 5 children in New Zealand live in food insecurity. And this is a recent study that was done by Bruce Kidd, I think his name is, and others, and it looked at the cost of a healthy diet versus the kind of current diet in New Zealand. And this is an interesting study because we've seen quite a few of these sorts of studies done internationally, looking at what is the diet that would be more aligned with, a low emissions future, or more aligned with, being good for our bodies, but also within environmental limits. And what we find is that a healthy diet is more expensive than the current diet that New Zealanders eat. And when we go further along and look to the diets that are more likely to be aligned with a low emissions future, they are the most expensive. And so this is kind of a challenge in terms of how do we, produce food, how do we meet all of our the costs associated with producing food in a way that is sustainable, but also produce food that is reasonably priced so it can be accessed by all people. And, this is a challenge because fruit and vegetables in New Zealand are still actually quite cheap, really. And many growers would say that they couldn't, they can't grow them, for a lesser price. So there is a difficult challenge here, and it's a societal one. But one of the things that I will come back to is thinking about, how we manage our natural resources and the way in which we provide for things that are essential for human health. So the other aspect of our vision, healthy food for all, is forever. And so forever, it's a long time. Maybe it goes back as well as forward. And when we think about forever, I think at the heart of that is sustainability. And, when we look to the future in New Zealand, we have to think about a future which has, where climate change is part of our future. And so part of my work, I work in looking at how the agriculture sector can reduce its emissions. I'm on the steering group of Horticulture, and half of New Zealand's emissions are related to animal agriculture. And we know that there is an opportunity for, the diversification of our farming systems into more horticultural products to reduce emissions. And of course that would need to be market-led because you have to sell the product. So that's something that we would have to grow before we could really expand. But we also need to think about the future challenges as well, and the resource needs of horticulture. We need highly productive land to grow on. We need reliable water. And so, what are the challenges that are coming in the future, and including, in the context of climate change adaptation. So, one of the things that we might expect more in the future are more extreme events. And so, one of the ways that we might, one of the ways we might protect ourselves from more extreme events are things like, crop protection structures. But we also see, Horticulture New Zealand has been involved in environment court cases where parties have objected to crop protection structures on the basis of amenity. They don't like the way they look. And so, we have challenges in terms of adapting our landscape so it is more resilient to a future. Another aspect here, around, the risk that we have already in terms of biosecurity and the potential for that risk to increase with a changing climate. One of the ways that growers manage this, vegetable growers manage, pest and diseases through crop rotation. And this is, really important, and all, outdoor vegetable growers in New Zealand would rotate their crops. But we struggle in terms of environmental regulation because we have environmental regulation in New Zealand which is really designed, I guess it's the 80-20 rule, it's designed for pasture farming. And we have struggled to get policy that would recognise and provide for crop rotation. Just this week, HortNZ is going to join an Environment Court appeal where parties have appealed the definition that would provide for crop rotation. So whilst we hear about regenerative farming, there are barriers, barriers that are, it's hard to understand exactly what the motivation is, but I think it's related to the ease of administrating things if they are sort of fixed in space rather than sort of moving about. And the final picture here is really about water. Horticultural products rely on a reliable supply of water. We know that our freshwater receiving environments in New Zealand are under pressure. Many of them are over-allocated in some part in terms of their water quality or some parts of their flow regime. And so we need to think about how we manage our water resources differently and more carefully in the future. There are many opportunities to increase efficiency. There are opportunities to store water and augment water, but we also need to think about the functioning of those rivers and streams and how we can provide for those in the future. And the other part, I suppose, this here is, I won't read this, but this is part 2 of the RMA. So the concept of sustainable management, it's not a new concept. I've been working in the RMA for more than 20 years, and in the RMA we had this concept about future generations. We understood about the life-supporting capacity of ecosystems, and we understood that the way and the rate that we met our social, economic and cultural needs would need to be adjusted to provide for those other parts. But we didn't necessarily achieve that. And I think one of the weaknesses that we had was, the assessment of cumulative effects. And that really is about the question that we asked. So whilst we sought to assess environmental effects, we weren't very good at assessing cumulative effects. We are now coming into a new time in resource management. We have, new acts that are being developed now with new concepts to help us hopefully develop a food system that operates within environmental limits and with a changing climate. One of those concepts that I'm familiar with is Te Mana o Te Wai within the National Policy Statement for Fresh Water. And there are a number of elements to that concept, and including a greater role for Māori in the management of water. But also it includes a hierarchy of obligations, and that puts the mana of water first and the essential health needs of people second and everything else third. And I think that is a useful framework in helping us, the part that we struggled with in the RMA was how to achieve the well-being of people and the well-being of the environment, whereas some places and sometimes they seem to be, in conflict. One of the arguments that HortNZ makes is that domestic food supply is an essential human health need and should be provided for within our natural resource management allocation frameworks. The other concept that is now being talked about and that we anticipate coming through into the new legislation is Te Mana o Te Taio. I won't talk about that because I don't quite know what form that will take yet. So I suppose, just summing up really, I was thinking about, I think we're moving from a time when we operated in the RMA, we hoped that our decisions were sort of agnostic. But when we look back at the decisions that were made, maybe they weren't. And so now we've come to a place where our environmental limits are reached, sometimes overshot. And so we are becoming more explicit about our values and decision making in order to determine how we can claw back natural resources and provide, for a future that is more within environmental limits. So my question really was about, the role of science in that. And I think there is a real need for science, for scientists to have the courage to consider problems and to be open to being wrong. That is such a powerful way of, methodology for assessing problems. And the other aspect of science, which is really important in our future decision making, is to have the courage to speak the truth. And, and I understand it does depend on the question, and, you can only speak the truth as you understand it, but it is very important. And to speak that to decision makers, but to everybody, because we're in a time now of so much information, but not all them, so much of that information might be, nonsense. So I thought I would leave you with a, equally lofty vision, seeking truth for all, forever. Thank you for your work.